Today we're going to be looking at an extract from Christmas Carol, with the idea being that we talk through this, we annotate it, and then we begin to move on to look at how to actually writing the answer. Now this, as you can see, is a GCSE style question. The extract is from right at the start of the novella, so it should be nice and approachable. But of course, the thing we have to remember is that we need to be using this as a springboard into the rest of the text. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do that in a minute. First of all, let's read it. Let's look at the question before we do read it through. So all the information you get is as you would get it. So read the following extract from chapter 1 and then answer the question that follows. In this extract, Scrooge is being introduced to the reader. And if we scroll down in amongst my annotations, you can see the question here. Starting with this extract, how does Dickens present Scrooge as an outsider to society? Of course, as you know, if the question's how, we also need to say why. What is it that Dickens hopes to actually do by making Scrooge appear as an outsider? But we also, we do have to define how that happens, what language and what structural features Dickens uses in the text and in the extract in order to get that across. So let's look at the extract and consider how is he an outsider. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, nor wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind man's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Okay, so we're going to look at my annotations. An important thing to say is, this is really a starting point for you. These are things that I've noticed. There's definitely more things you can talk about, more kind of close language analysis you can do. The second thing to talk about is you'll see a lot of the time I try and make reference to other parts of the text. This, as we've spoken about, needs to be a springboard. It needs to be the starting point to your essay. Yes, you need to look at this very closely, but you also need to be looking in detail throughout the whole of the text. So the first thing I want us to talk about is this motif of cold and heat in general. Now, throughout the novella, we get this position of everything that is good and charitable and festive and Christmassy is warm. The people who greet Scrooge when they do are warm people. When the parties are happening, the fires are roaring, there is warmth to the spirit of charity and togetherness that Dickens wants us to follow. And that is in great contrast to Scrooge. He is, as we've said, the antithesis of the Christmas spirit. So for all that Christmas is charitable and sharing and empathetic and kind, Scrooge is not. He's solitary and he's cruel and he's selfish. And that is the spirit, the way of living that Dickens wants to warn us about. Scrooge is an embodiment of that kind of cruel Victorian mindset, which, don't forget, was a fairly conventional view at the time. It wasn't popular. There was many people campaigning against it, but the poor law was a thing because that's what some people wanted. So it's not like Scrooge is just a completely completely made up character who's got nothing to do with reality. He's not. He is a reflection, okay, a caricature, but a reflection of some actual attitudes. So that's why this extract starts, external heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, nor wintry weather chill him. So it's important then that we remember that this is a recurring motif, okay? This recurring motif of cold keeps coming back, and warmth, we know, is symbolic of the Christmas spirit, of generosity and community. So we have this already. Scrooge is contrary to the Christmas spirit, as we know it already. And he's stubborn, reflect his consistent stubbornness, this idea that heat and cold had little influence on him. And this is the first time I want us to think about another point in the text, other than the recurring motif of cold, which happens throughout, and we can find our quotes from almost anywhere in the text. This one, we need to start thinking about his stubbornness and his initial unwillingness to change. A really good example of that is in Fred's dinner later on in the novella, where they're talking about how pointless it would be to invite him. How you could never turn Scrooge from the person he is to a caring person. That's what they're talking about. And I think Dickens there is telling us, isn't he, that it is difficult to change people's mentalities, to change this stubbornness, because it's not always in their benefits necessarily. If the things cost them more, they won't see it as being in their benefit. So the stubbornness is already at play there. So then we move on. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open. Now, there is a kind of anaphora in the repetition of no. This is a very kind of Dickens way of writing. It's a very, very emphatic way of repeating yourself. To really kind of hammer home the cruelty of Scrooge, the effect of each of these weathers is horrible, and we can imagine it, can't we? If we're walking in the pelting rain and falling snow, we'd pull our coats around us to get especially warm, and that is the reaction he expects people to have when they meet Scrooge. And there is, this is, remember, in many ways this is Gothic text. I would not say it's an entirely conventional Gothic text. It differs in many, many ways. But this weather as a character is something that Dickens employs throughout, and it is a convention of the Gothic. The way that, he personifies weather throughout this text, and it's almost like it is a character itself, and it's a sinister character at that. So it's one that we have to be aware of. And he's using this very cleverly, Dickens, that this kind of Gothic motif of weather as a character, he's using it to help us understand Scrooge. He's not saying that Scrooge has these characteristics, he's saying Scrooge is worse than these characteristics. And again, that sets him apart from the ordinary people that we go on to meet later. Another interesting thing to talk about, we're talking about the motif of cold. But everyone came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Now, it's a bit of dry humour. He's referring obviously to how the snow can fall handsomely, and Scrooge is never appearing like that, So everything's likeable about the weather and the snow, because, Dickens recognises how festive it makes things. But Scrooge is not like that. And this is that kind of dry humour that really marks this text out. It's supposed to be kind of humorous, it's supposed to be light-hearted, and Dickens has done this wonderful thing where he's balanced a ghost story, an allegorical ghost story, with kind of humour that suits the time, as he says in the prologue. I said it's the dry humour that characterises descriptions in this. There are descriptions throughout this text that are actually quite funny, even though what Dickens might be describing is something ghostly or something supernatural, or in Scrooge's case something just downright horrible. So this reminds me, the first example we see of that is when Scrooge is kind of reflecting on Marley's ghost and talking about his guts and didn't think he'd have any and things like that. And it's a mix of comedy and ghouls, and that's exactly the tone that Dickens wanted. Remember, this is a text that needs to be sold at Christmas time. His intention was to make loads of money off it, but also to share this message of goodwill. And this next piece is interesting because it's very, very Dickensian. Now, Dickens was, we know that in his writing he wrote a lot of non-fiction as well, and in that non-fiction he would spend a lot of time with kind of traditionally marginalised people, homeless people, poor people. He would go visit the ragged schools, he'd visit the workhouses, We know he gave that famous speech in Manchester after having seen the conditions there. So he's really aware of the life of the working poor in contemporary society. And that is often characterised in the way he describes people from marginalised groups. So children, beggars, blind people, all of those, very rarely does Dickens write characters like that who are not kind of sympathetic, or we're not sympathetic towards, who are not likeable in some way. I think, that, again, this is... So Gothic texts obviously are an extension or development of romantic fiction and poetry. And this kind of innocence that comes from a simple way of life is something that runs through all of those texts. So children obviously symbolise kind of innocence and purity, and a life that has not been affected yet by the realities of the world and the Industrial Revolution. So people like Dickens, and you think about Blake, you think about Shelley, kind of they used that imagery to represent innocence and purity. And that is what Scrooge is kind of alien to. We're asking, how is he an outsider? He's an outsider because he doesn't have this kind of this positive spirit that Dickens gives characters like blind men and children and beggars, and that is shown that even these people who are traditionally kind of the lowest of society greet Scrooge with not even contempt. They don't want to acknowledge him. So no one ever stopped him to say, "My dear Scrooge, how are you?" Again, if we look at Fred, he's probably the exception of this. Fred is the character that gives Scrooge the most respect, that shows most of himself to Scrooge. And he is, because of that, he is the kind of exception that proves the rule. Nobody else wants to speak to him. So no beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. A trifle there is money, and just a little bit of money. Obviously, Scrooge would not have shared any. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in his life inquired the way to such and such a place. It says here that Dickens might be suggesting, it implies he's not someone to follow. This is not an example. Even the blind man's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming, would tug their owners into the doorway and wag their tails. No eye at all is better than the evil eye, dark master. So there is, isn't there, throughout the first few pages, the first stave of this text, there is a constant kind of connection and either subtle or kind of overt when it comes to the knocker, when it comes to Marley dragging his chains. There is a connection with the supernatural. And I think this is what Dickens is doing. He's implying to us, just letting us know that this is in fact a Gothic text, and there is going to be some supernatural things. If the name of the text didn't tell you that, and if the opening sentence didn't tell you that, there are constant hints to keep that air of the supernatural, that mysterious air going. So the final little paragraph, but what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he lacked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Nuts in that case means kind of easy, like nothing, something light. This interesting sentence there, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life. So obviously it's a metaphor. Talks about his general bearing in life. He did literally edge his way along paths to stay away from people. But we're going to see in the later staves of this book, just what that actually did. It reminded me, just coming up, we're going to talk about Bell and how the way his life. The choice of path he took brought them apart, kind of pulled those two apart. And that's a really good example of the warnings that Dickens is giving us about what will happen if you choose to live this isolated and solitary life. So that's the extract. One of the things that I want us just to look at is what ideas we could have. But this is a sort of plan, I suppose you could talk about it being a plan for the essay. So a few of the things we need to consider when we're talking about Scrooge being an outsider, what are the qualities of this ideal society that he lacks? Dickens is trying to make him seem contrary to, the antithesis of the ideal society that Dickens wants, and that is one of charity and kindness and goodwill. So how is Scrooge different to that? That's what this question needs to answer. How does he differ from the Christmas spirit? So this is about Christmas, but Christmas, as we know, is representative of an idea. As Scrooge is, Scrooge is the opposite of that. But for Dickens, this isn't just about enjoying kind of the presents and writing a nice festive Christmas text. Christmas is representative of something, and it embodies ideas of charity and fellowship and goodwill and kindness that Dickens saw as lacking in certain parts of Victorian society. So the question is, how does Dickens make Scrooge's kind of conventional views seem cruel? And they're conventional in a sense, because as I said, there were some people who were in favour of the poor law. They got passed through Parliament for a reason. So how does he make that view cruel and appear cruel? That's one thing we have to define. And one of the ways he does it is through Scrooge. And that's why that question is as an outsider. So some other things to think about, like how does Scrooge differ from the Christmas spirit in Stave 1? How is his outcast status confirmed later? And we're going to talk about his childhood. We're going to talk about his young working life, as I said. And finally, how does the eventual sight of his lonely grave help us understand this outsider status? And of course, how does that help in his eventual redemption?